Hello, I'm David Marler, and welcome to this week's mini lecture on biographical criticism. In this mini lecture, we're going to talk about what biographical criticism is, the kind of questions that we have to ask when we apply this critical approach to literature, how we can find information about the author, and when biographical criticism can be harmful or helpful to literary analysis. So when we talk about biographical criticism, we often refer to the biographical approach to literary criticism. This means that we look at the specific biographies of both personal but also political and larger world events and how those events had an effect on the works. So for instance, if we look at some of the authors that we teach at school, such as Shakespeare or Charles Dickens or Margaret Atwood, we can see that the major life events of these authors and also the world around them have had an effect on the works that they've written and the works that we study. So we want to look at how do the events in an author's life play out in their work. And it's quite simple how to do this. First, you have to examine the author's life. You have to look at their childhood. You have to look at the family members that they've had and the major life changes that they've gone through. And the easiest way to do this is to research and make a timeline of the major events that have happened. So family, deaths, education, place, time period. And you also want to make a timeline of the major events that the person has lived through. For instance, the Second World War, or the potato famine, or the independence of a country. Then you have to look at the specific story, because it's not a biography of the author, but it's looking at the characters and their lives and what the author says about it. So you have to look at the narration and the story or the plot. You have to make a list of the events that have happened in the plot, and you have to think about the theme. What are the major discussions that are going on in the book, and how do they all relate, and what conclusions can you draw from this? So an example is Charles Dickens's Great Expectation. Now the first thing that we would have to do is have a look at Charles Dickens's life. We'd have to see his family situation when he was a child, who he married, how many children he had, and more importantly, the type of life that he lived. So if we look at Dickens's life, we can see that he was born in 1812. He was one of 8 children and left to work in a factory when his father was sent to a debtor's prison. Now, this was a big event in Dickens's life. The debtor's prison and the shame that it brought his family led him to have no formal education, and it essentially sent him off into the world having to fend for himself. And a lot of times, many academics call him a reformist. This leads to the question of why he was viewed as a reformist. And I think that we can actually find evidence of this in his book, Great Expectations. Now, the character that I see this the most with is MAGWITCH. Now, we see only MAGWITCH twice in the entire novel. We see him at the very beginning when Pip helps him and he's a little boy, and once again at the very end when Pip finds out that MAGWITCH is his benefactor. And this says a lot about Dickens's views about the criminal system, and more importantly about criminals. Because if we look at the best characters in the book, the ones like Pip's stepdad, Joe, or MAGWITCH, we can see that the people that are hardworking, that don't have a lot, and that actually come from humble means end up being the most generous and the best characters. With MAGWITCH, we see that he's the person who changes his life. He turns around and he becomes the benefactor who gives all of the money to Pip and ensures that he has an education. But we can also use this approach to look at other novels. For instance, we look at Rhonda Gerard's A Map of Home. And when we're looking at this, we have to see exactly the aspects of Rhonda Gerard's life and the way that they've come into her novel with her main character, Nadali. So part of the assignment for the first year students is to look at the character Nadali's life and see what type of influence Gerard's own life has had on the novel. You can make a list of her background, where she lived, where she was born, where she came from, and compare that to that of Nadali's. And this allows us to see what themes and what subjects are covered in the novel. Thank you.